Hello, this is Dr. Robert O. I'm ready to share the lecture 5 of our Cup and Earl Patron-Client Relationship Dynamic in Church Planting in Cambodia for Washington International Mission University. Are you ready? We're now moving to chapter 2. Before anything, let's pray. Father, I thank you for this opportunity to continue with this lecture series. Teach us, Lord, that we will be sharpened to become effective workers for your kingdom. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, let's round applause. Paksu. As we enter the second chapter, let's have a quick review of what we have discussed so far. It was introduction of talking about patron-client, relationship in social anthropology, and patron as father. And so it was pretty much talking about cup and first, and then I talked about how patron-client correlates to Korean cup and Well, chapter 2 starts out by this patron-client relationship issue, introduction of the chapter 2. I have learned that patron-client dynamics between Korean missionaries and Cambodian Christians are foundational component in their relationship. So what happens in the research is that you cannot just go and define whatever you observe based on your own knowledge, because then you'll be self-study, self-proclamation without any context of the scholar's work before. So that's why it takes a long time. When you learn and you observe, and some kind of social dynamic is happening, but you don't know how to call that. And so through the literature review and through the observing the data, all the interviews that I've done in English and Korean, and I'm running it as a program to see if there's any repetition of the word, any similar kind of concept, issues, and then out of that, and then you could come to a conclusion. So that's why it is important that, as they said, that academic study is standing on the shoulders of the giants, right? So prior to you, someone actually did study and wrote about it, and you read about it, and then standing on their giant shoulder, so that you take that same learning to the next level. So that's what I've done, and I begin to understand the foundational component, right? There must be many different kind of issues. But as I observe and interviewing Korean missionaries, interviewing Cambodian pastors, and some of the word has been linked together. For example, when Cambodian pastors talks about church, it's a church, like church, people, ministry, program. But when Korean missionaries talk about church, it's about building. And so then you cross-reference it, and you could do that with using the Microsoft Word macro function. What you do is that every time the word church is mentioned in Korean, 교회, in English church, and then you look it up and then start comparing. And then you could itemize section by section who said, oh, this is Cambodian pastor saying church, but then put a note, or he's saying as a church, like a ministry, like his church or someone else's church, Sunday school in the church. Okay, out of 100 times, it's 95 times used that way. 5 times as a building. Every time Korean missionaries talk about church, 교회, about 95% of the time, it's about building. And I said, okay, why is that? And then you link it, and then you interview more, and then realize because Korean missionaries feel responsible to build the building for the Korean pastors. And then, of course, you have to ask why. Why do they feel that they need to build? When the Korean missionary, the missionary to Korea came, and it was Korean people who spent their money to build a church, who made the shift in policy, right? I mean, it's complicated, but basically then you realize, they feel that way because they feel like a patron to Cambodian pastors who function more like client, okay? So that's the key thing. So it's not something that I just came up with and decide to make a statement like that. Literally, I have hundreds of pages of interview transcript to back that up. And I have a macro, micro, all kinds of files. So you really have to come up with that. Now, so how do I come up with that conclusion? And I already kind of said it. So when you make a statement like that, you need to be able to academically back it up with the data, not, George, my friend said that, or that's not going to be enough. Or I watch from some YouTube that's what they say. Well, that's not, well, maybe talking to a friend over tea or coffee, maybe, but not in the academic field, right? Especially master level study. You cannot say that that's what I heard. I heard from where, right? So the research argument you must have. How to craft a research argument. And this is important because every research, every thesis, and someday you will write a master thesis at this school. Every thesis is an argument. Every thesis should be researched. That's why research argument is critical. So how to design a research argument? Begin with the research question. Answer is your main claim. That's your thesis. Claim is supported by reasons or data. Reasons are supported by evidence, data. Acknowledge and respond to other views. So this is what other people think. This is what Patron-Client looks like in Japan. This is what Patron-Client looks like in Thailand. And their term for that is this, but Kamai's term is this. So you kind of back it up and you read thoroughly through literally thousands of pages. And then you come up with your own research argument. Whatever you're arguing for becomes your thesis. Research paper is an argument. It's not a book. If you want to write a book, just go ahead and write a book. You can say whatever you want. You don't have to back it up. It's just a book. But when you're writing a thesis, people ask, well, how do you know that to be true? But every sentence, every argument you make, well, this is according to Eisenstadt, this is according to Muno, this is according to James Scott, this is according to Ledgerwood. And as I was sharing that, you get familiar with all the professors and use their argument. Because when you make a claim, you're making a claim, something with the proof of data. That's the key point. You don't just make a blank claim. You cannot, right? When you make a claim, well, you need a proof or some kind of data, right? You need a proof, and then when the proof then you objection, you have to object what others would object to your proof, and then also answer their objection. Then you could come to conclusion. That's how argument, claim in thesis is made. Okay, so for example, I believe there's a patron-client dynamics happening between Korean missionaries and Cambodian pastors. That's my claim. Where is the proof? These are my proof. These are 120 interview I've done. Based on the transcript, this is what I got. Objection, but why is it called kapenur? You argue with that and you come with conclusion. Okay? You need to be ready to answer objection because people would object. If they don't object, you need to object to your own question. Because if you don't do that, then you will be just claim, self-proclaimed claim. And thesis is not self-proclaimed claim. Thesis is data-driven and objection answered, and so that your conclusion could stand firm, okay, until someone could break the conclusion. So objection, objection, objection. And if it's a brand new field and then you really don't have any objection from others, because this is a brand new field and you need to object to your own proof. Now in Cambodian culture, Cambodians do not use the term patron-client nor kapenur. So you could object to my thesis, because my thesis is that there is a patron-client relationship that exists between Cambodians and Koreans, or kapenur, patron-client. Then you could object and say, sir, we don't have those terms in Cambodian. So what you're saying is your description of what we're going through, but that does not really describe what we're going through. That's great objection. See, that's the kind of stuff that I'm looking for in master thesis. You cannot just make a point blank claim. And then said, well, I said it, you better believe it. Well, it's not Bible. So you better have objection. So when people object, like, well, there's no formal term for patron-client in Khmer culture. Oh, good. So this is out of my PhD thesis. This is out of the PhD, M is PhD manuscript, page 54. Since there are no formal terms in Khmer or Cambodian language, identifying the characteristic of patron-client relationships in other fields of study is essential. So because, well, number one, Cambodians don't research. Number two, Koreans don't do research, especially on this area. So what am I supposed to do? Create my own term? No, you have to borrow from the field, especially the missiology never tackle the patron-client relationship. Matter of fact, the missiologists normally consider patron-client relationship evil in some others' culture, which I think is quite non-academic view. And so what happened is that they try to do away with someone's patron-client relationship, thinking that American democratic system is better. And I beg to differ. So they go and one of the actually American missionary that I interviewed, she said that my life goal is to destroy patron-client relationship in Cambodia. I said, no, that's not the role of a missionary. The role of a missionary is to preach the gospel, right? And then let the gospel eventually, if Lord wills, then that will be done. But I mean, patron-client relationship exists in America right now, as the patron of the political party gave Trump and Biden 14 billion. And so it operates without the umbrella of the term. Without using the term, patron-client dynamic exists. So for an American missionary to come and try to destroy patron-client relationship structure in Cambodia will be oxymoron. But a lot of times we do that over and over again, thinking that our system is better. No, we just preach the gospel and let God take care of their system. So I had to borrow from Muno. Muno suggests the following: 5 essential characteristics of patron-client relationship in socioanthropology. And 210 means that Muno's book published in 210, page 4. The strategy here is to propose critical characteristic of patron-client relationship, thereby identify the existence of patron-client relationship between Korean missionaries and Cambodian Christians in Cambodia in general, and between TED and CBC church planters more specifically. So what I've done is that, okay, well, there are 5 characteristics. I mean, there are 10, but out of the 10, I said, at least the dynamic between Korean missionaries and Cambodian pastors, out of 10, this 5 characteristic of what Professor Muno of Germany is defining what patron-client relationship is. Well, there it is. Let me see if I did that more specifically. Okay, the patron-client relationship is dyadic, which means that it's 2 people involved, not 1. It's not monoadic, it's dyadic. 2, minimum 2. The patron-client relationship is asymmetrical, which means there's up and there's down. There's to have and to powerful, not powerful, right? Third, the patron-client relationship is personal and enduring, meaning that it is not with the organization, institution they associate. It's very personal, in Cambodia at least, right? In the Western, it's the institution, government that becomes a patron. But in Cambodian context, it's very personal. I know you, you know me, you know my father, you know my sister, we have dinner together, so it's very relational. And enduring, meaning that it's meant for lifetime, unless something happens. It's not contract-based like capitalists, like, oh, you work for 2 years and that's it, sayonara, I have no hard feeling for you. No, patron-client is very enduring and personal. Number 4, the patron-client relationship is reciprocal. Reciprocal. I'm sorry, reciprocal. Reciprocal means you give, I take, I give, you take. So give and take. It's not always one way, right? Giving one way will be called paternalism. Right? You'll be patronizing somebody, treating like a kid until he's 75. That would be paternalistic. Reciprocal means I respect each other. There's something I could give it to you because I received something from you. The patron-client relationship is voluntary. You cannot force someone into patron-client. That's the beauty of it, isn't it? So out of the relationship, I choose and you choose, and choosing is mutual. I got that from Muno, And it was a huge, huge breakthrough when I found it. Because I'm reading all this thesis and I'm trying to figure out how do I put this relationship dynamic and how do I coin it so that we could have a same kind of lens to look at, right? Wolfgang Muno is an interim professor of political science in Germany, but he's political science, ethnology, and public law, right? Mainz and Venezuela. He graduated in '96. MA and has a PhD in political science from the University of Mainz in Germany. Since then, he has taught in Mainz as a senior lecturer. He was also senior researcher of University of Würzburg in Germany and conduct research in Venezuela, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Mexico, and Thailand. And then when I read that, I said, yes, then he understands Southeast Asian culture. And so he's sensitive. So his writing actually reflects that. Then this is the same thing that I made with Ledgerwood. I create picture and all his information that I learn about him, I try to categorize so that I would get to know the professor that I made a quotation on intimately. So that you won't be vacuum, you won't be just some guy in the book. No, I have a picture, I have his information. If I choose to, I could actually email him and ask, what do I think about? I never did that, but if I came to terms with it, and these scholars, I know they're busy, but they are very, very generous. You know, especially up and coming ones. They love the fact that someone else is doing their paper, thesis, PhD on their topic. So they would respond to you. And he wrote, and this is the paper that I read that really really changed the direction of my thesis. Wolfgang Muno, Conceptualizing and Measuring Clientelism, paper to be presented at the workshop, right? Neo-Patronalism in Various World Regions, August 2010, so already 11 years old. But when I actually started my PhD at 2009, imagine, it's brand new, it's fresh. So I started my PhD 2009. He presented paper 2010. So next year I'm learning, and so I'm learning from him as he launched. So he wrote extensively, and there he goes. Dyadic. You see the term dyadic? Dyadic means there's two parts involved. There's patron and there's client. It's not horizontal relationship. It's dyadic, hierarchical relationship. Okay. And then high patron. So then he came up with the fact there's a primary patron, there's a first order broker, and then clients. You know, when I first started using the first order broker and then I try to publish in Korean quarterly mission magazines and things of that nature, Koreans react strongly about the term broker because they said the term broker has so much negative connotation. Not denotation. Denotation, dictionary definition is, you know, there are the go-between, mediators. So there's nothing evil about that. But the term broker has been used and abused, and abuse of the broker in Korean culture is so severe that if you call a missionary first order broker, then you'll be improper to transliterate the term broker. So we had to change soft landing the word broker to different Korean words. But anyways, the point is whether you're a broker or whatever, that you are in between in this dyadic relationship, asymmetrical. There's someone with power, someone who doesn't, someone with authority, someone who doesn't, someone with money, someone doesn't have. So you create that. And then it's in that way it's asymmetrical, meaning that there's an order. And then it's reciprocal. This is very important. And this is where they asked me to come and teach on reciprocity of patron and client in the context of the New Testament study, grace. Did you know that when Apostle Paul was using the word in Greek, charis, which means grace, it never meant to be free. When Apostle Paul used the term charis 2,000 years ago in their culture, grace was paying the price, giving something in return. So the whole grace theology, although there's like 16 different translation of grace, which I'm not going to go into, about 4 or 5 of them actually talks about payment. There's a sense of payment when you are graced. So in the patron-client relationship, if someone graced you to be a patron, there's a payment you need to make to the patron. It's not free. So that's what we talk about, reciprocity. There is a patron-client relationship. In any patron-client relationship, it's not patronistic. It's not just giving unconditionally all the time. No, we expect something when I become your patron. Okay, very important. And so as I was reading and researching him, I begin to then connect Muno with all these people. There were so many names, but this name stood out. Eisenstadt, Shmuel Eisenstadt, right? From where? From, well, it was published in Cambridge, but he's from Hebrew University. Wow, he was amazing man. So then I made a file, patron-client dynamic scholar. Then I must have 20 pages on him of his thought. And then he, okay, let me just read. He was an Israeli sociologist. In 1959, he was appointed to teach post in sociology department of Hebrew University in Jerusalem from 1990 until death of September 2010. Wow, he passed away when I started my PhD. He was professor emeritus. He held countless guest professorship, University of Chicago, Harvard, Zurich, Vienna, Bern, Stanford, and Heidelberg, and among others. So highly, highly intellectual. He basically wrote a Bible on patron-client. He went around the world, did like 40, 50 countries and did study on patron-client, including Japan. I mean, amazing scholars. So he writes, the form of social relationship described by the terms patronage and patron-client is central concern of sociologists, anthropologists, and political scientists today. Okay, this is his writing. Characterized by the voluntary and highly personal, but often fully institutionalized nature, it is type of behavior found in almost every human society. Okay, so already off the bat, he's saying that every culture has it, every society has it. They just may not call it that at this point of the secularized civil world, right? But still the culture where is the farming culture, is still developing country, still call it patron-client. So Eisenstadt wrote a legendary book called Patron, Clients, and Friends, Interpersonal Relationship and Structure and Trust in Society through Cambridge, 1984. But that's the book, when I found that book, that opened up the totally brand new research, right? So when he did the whole study in Japan, he did Japan twice, modern Japan and classical Japan, or old Japan, and learn about patron-client. Eisenstadt states that Japanese patron-client relationship, the oyabung and gobung link may be characterized as a highly emotional and diffuse dyadic arrangement. A superior adopts an inferior, and latter recognizes the long-term authority of the former. Both partners maintain a long-term, personalized mutual concern with each other's public and private affairs. So when patron-client study went to Japan, they realized, well, patron-client does exist, but in Japanese cultural context, it should be not called patron-client, but it should be called oyabung and gobung. Oyabung means boss, gobung means the junior. Oyabung means senior, gobung means junior. In Korean context, it's kap and ul. But when we say oyabung and gobung, it makes sense. It makes so much sense for me to even understand what patron-client looks like in Japan, because I learned Japanese. You know, I'm very familiar with Japanese culture, and oyabun gobun basically is in yakuza or Japanese mafia, oyabun gobun, that kind of relationship, and that kind of stems out of the Shogun era, where Shogun, the samurai, ruled, and everybody, he's a protector, you know, the benevolent leader, protects the poor and the disfranchised, powerless. So that dynamic has come through Japan. It's called Oyabong and Gobong. So, and then when I read that, and the kind of a revelation, I said, oh my gosh, in Korea, then it should be called Kappener, because patron-client does not really describe well, fully. It sort of refers to it, but if Japanese patron-client is called Oyabong and Gobong, then Korean patron-client should be called Kappener. Okay? And so all these books after books after books. And then I said, who could really identify that in Cambodia? And then I found Scott James. He's another crazy, smart professor who wrote quite extensively on Southeast Asia. And James Scott is Patron-Client Politics and Political Change in Southeast Asia, the American Political Scientist Review. And when I started reading him, I thought, wow, he could really explain well what's happening in Cambodia. Born 1936, American Sterling Professor of Political Science and Anthropology of Yale University. He's also Director of Program Agrarian Study and noted scholar of anarchism. Scott, he also studied MIT, brilliant scholar. Funny thing about him is when he retired, he just bought a ranch and raising sheep. Kind of hip guy. He actually is the one who started talking about patron-client clusters. So he started writing 1970s about this. That's why Muno picks it up. Muno kind of draws in more, more using the computer graphic. But he's the first one to talk about patron-client dynamics, pyramids, and how a patron could have multiple client and multiple client could then turn around. And this is a first order broker. So he talks about that. Basic patron-client dynamics I already shared with you. This patron is dyadic. Social dyad, which means two, group of two people. Okay, that's the smallest possible social group, two. Three is a community. Two is a couple, but at least need two. He talks about the social dynamics, homogeneity of the following, and then he started going more into the details. I have written more in details in my book, so please read that. And if you have any questions, bring it to forward, write to me in the email that I have under. And then that's where I found George Foster. George Foster, you know what, instead of going further, I will just bring the George Foster to the next lecture. Yeah, because it's already reaching 30 minutes. So I just want to do a 30-minute lecture and then collect it, and your Q&A, I'm going to collect 3 at a time. So this is 5. So 4, 5, 6 will be one cluster, and then we're going to do Q&A through Zoom. I hope it was helpful. So I'll bring the lecture 6 next time. Whatever question you have, if you want to challenge me, that's good. I even love that. When you object to my own thesis, please do, but don't just do it out of your creative mind. Read something, bring different view. Okay, so I'll see you at next lecture.